I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, Individuals with Disabilities and Crime Victimization. A couple of housekeeping items. You're all in listen-only mode. I can unmute you one at a time. I'll know that you have a question if you raise your hand in the little toolbar on the WebEx or the GoToWebinar screen monitor, and I will call on you as we go. So raise your hand, and we will stop occasionally for questions, and I'll open your mics so you can ask the presenter anything that you may want clarification of. The presentation today is being recorded, and we will be posting it on the NYSARC YouTube site following the webinar, and I will also be distributing copies of all of these slides to any individual who has registered. So all of that being said, let me start by introducing Dr. Scott Modell. Scott received his Ph.D. from Florida State University in 1997. He's currently the Deputy Commissioner for the Tennessee Department of Children's Services, but he was also the Deputy Commissioner for the Tennessee Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Prior to moving to Tennessee, spent 15 years as a professor at California State University at Sacramento, and in the last 5 years of his tenure there, he served as the director of the university's Autism Center for Excellence. He is an expert in child abuse, crime victims with disabilities, disability etiology, and interview techniques. And he has authored 6 books and has published over 200 articles and abstracts. I had the fortune of seeing Scott earlier this year at a local presentation, and it was excellent, and he was gracious enough to spend some time with us here today. So with that, I will turn this over to Scott for the webinar.
Thanks, Eric. Well, welcome everybody. I think we have about 40 people or so. This is a real-life webinar. I'm in my office. This is sort of me every day. So I may turn here and there if the phone rings or one of my phones ring, or you hear things or people knocking on my door. That's just real life. But I'm happy to take this time out of my day to share some of this information with you. My screen's doing a couple funny things. There's this Beats by Dr. Dre audio thing that's coming up. That's not something I purchased, but it just happens to be the audio. Hopefully it'll go away when I advance the slides. But at any point, if you have a question, feel free to just raise your hand. I guess Eric described that process, or you can put something in the chat screen, which I can see on the side. So for the next hour or so, I'm going to be sharing with you information about individuals with disabilities and crime victimization. And mostly we'll be talking about, across certain disability groups, what makes some individuals more susceptible to victimization than others, and what are some of the things that we can do about it, and how do we improve our communication. Now, I had the fortunate opportunity to present to many law enforcement agencies, police officers, district attorneys, child protective service workers, adult protective service workers, and so forth across the country and in other countries. But I also have an opportunity to speak with folks who are direct care staff for individuals with disabilities. So some of this information you may know, some may be new to you, but I believe at the end of it you'll have some good information as it relates to crime victimization, and hopefully we'll have some fun while you're doing it. Every picture you see will be of children and or adults I've worked with over the years. Prior to my role in administration, I was a university professor, and I directed our university's Autism Center for Excellence. But I was a professor for 15 years, had a number of different residential and day programs that I started, community-based programs. So the pictures are like this young man here. It's one of our summer residential programs that we had for older children and adolescents with physical disabilities. So without further ado, see if I can get my slide to advance. So that's the part that was tricky earlier. There we go. It's rendering. I can see it. You have it. I just don't know why this Beats by Dr. Dre thing is showing. So I don't know how to get that off. Let's see. I'd like to move it, but there's nothing I can do right now. So we'll just, I guess we'll have to deal with it. So if we look at these two girls were in one of our other residential programs, and it's funny story about the picture. They requested, because I asked them if I could use their picture for these presentations, and they said, sure. And this was like the 15th take. They kept changing clothes and didn't like any of the pictures, but this is the one they finally chose. The disability represents about 50 million Americans, and it's really thought of as the only minority group that anybody can join at any time. I have a friend who has a disability. He has a spinal cord injury, and he describes it as being, or described me as being a TAB, which is temporarily able-bodied, meaning anybody, again, can join the group. I used to tell my graduate students there's 3,247 different disabilities, and they'd start writing it down, and I'd say, well, don't write it down. I'm making the number up. But there's definitely over 3,000 different disabilities, and it's impossible to be an expert on them all. And fortunately, we have access to a lot of good information that, you know, through the internet and through the explosion of information that has become available to us, we can learn about disabilities that used to be very, very difficult to do so. I mean, those are the sounds that I'm telling you about you'll hear every so often. So this is a young man who was in one of our clinics. His level of severity of disability was such that he didn't qualify for our autism center, so he had to come to one of our weekly clinics. But realities for him and other children and adults with disabilities, sometimes they, especially those who need assistance with activities of daily living, may lose a sense of what is their own body, what's not their own body, what's the lines between privacy and hygienics and sexuality can sometimes be blurred because of that. We typically expect less for what they want to achieve, what we expect individuals with disabilities to achieve. And historically, we typically reward obedience and passivity. Many individuals with disabilities, especially those with intellectual disabilities, are very obedient and passive. The ones that, you know, I was a special education teacher as well, and when I share this information with folks in the field, they say, no, you know, no way. You know, some of the kids with disabilities that I work with presented the most significant behavior problems. Well, sure, I think individuals without disabilities can present significant behavior challenges. It just seems that it's a higher prevalence because we allocate most of our time to those that have the most serious behavior problems. But in general, both in practice and in the research, individuals with disabilities, especially those with intellectual disabilities, tend to be more obedient and passive, and we reward that behavior. And that can be a risk factor for abuse or neglect as well. Some individuals have a history of engaging in problem behavior or maladaptive behavior to gain access to tangibles, things that they want, or to get out of things that they don't want. And this young man here, excuse me, this young man here is a perfect example. So let's say you have a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old where they have a history, maybe they don't communicate well, so they pinch, bite, scratch, hit to sort of communicate and get what they want. Well, you can manage that when they're 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, but a young man like this who you really can't tell from the picture, who is 6'2", 240 pounds, and has a 20-year history of hitting, pinching, biting, scratching to get what he wants, it can become seriously problematic, not just for him, but for others, and that puts him at risk for abuse and neglect. These two young ladies started out as participants in two of our residential programs, and they've completed the programs and aged out and then became staff. So like the young man in the previous slide, like a number of people with disabilities, again, depending on the nature and severity of the disability, depending upon the services provided, where they're located, they can be socially isolated, have a lot of difficulty being accepted by peers. We know strong peer groups can be barriers for being abused, neglected, and particularly in schools, bullied. It works out pretty well in elementary school, where kids with disabilities are all kids are pulled into that sort of community school. They hang in the community together. The parents know each other. And by the time they reach middle school, they're taken out of those elementary schools, those community schools, all bunch of communities put together in a middle school with puberty sprinkled in, and it gets a little bit harder and more difficult for those kids with disabilities to be accepted by their peers and have good peer groups. But regardless of the reality of life for any child, adolescent, or adult with a disability, and across disability groups, autism, intellectual disability, physical disability, and so forth, we know very clearly from the literature that they are disproportionately criminally victimized. And the new data just came out. I actually got it yesterday, and I was considering putting it into these slides, and I just sort of ran out of time. But the new data shows pretty much the same as what the national studies are showing us, is that folks with disabilities are at high risk. It's really triple the rate. The average across all disabilities is triple the rate. And we look across years from 2009 to 2011. I think the new data looks at from 2008 to 2012. But we see increases in rapes, robberies, aggravated assaults, and simple assaults. But what it breaks down like in the 2011 rates, and now the new report that just came out has the 2012 rates, and they look similar. But the overall victimization rate, the violent victimization rate, was twice the rate. And I believe the new data is showing that it's triple the rate. I think we average out triple because you have violent victimization as double, serious violent as triple. Males are about double the rate of victimization than males without disabilities, and females are triple the rate. But what's interesting, if you start to look across certain disabilities, those with intellectual disabilities, so across all disability groups, those with intellectual disabilities, again, the new term intellectual disabilities, the new term for mental retardation, had the highest rate of victimization. Their rate doubled from 2009 to 2011. If you are an individual with a disability and you required assistance with activities of daily living, such as bathing, bathrooming, dressing, eating, mobility, that your rate tripled from 2009 to 2011. And then the average rates if you had more than one disability, so autism and a physical disability, cerebral palsy and an intellectual disability, your rate was double that of those other individuals with disabilities. So you were really quadruple the rate, 4 times the rate of the general population if you had 2 or more disability types. Hate crimes. While hate crimes overall have been declining, hate crimes for individuals with disabilities from 2012 to 2013 doubled. Numbers are still pretty low, but doubling of hate crimes, even if the numbers are low to begin with, is disturbing. And again, in the context of overall hate crimes going down, this is something that we should be watching. We know that some offenders specifically go after victims who may not communicate well, they may not be good reporters of information. In fact, the evidence tells us that the risk of victimization goes up. I can tell you this in my practice, not just what the literature says, that I've had cases in Arizona, case in the coast in Oregon, and all over California, where victims were physically, or in the cases that I'm thinking of, sexually abused, and you hear the perpetrator saying things, as I'm watching the interview of this one man who sexually abused the gentleman he was caring for, and when asked why him, why did you choose him, his response was, this is the perpetrator. I knew I could get away with it because I knew we wouldn't be able to tell anybody. Reminds me of a case of a 3-year-old girl with autism that was being raped by her stepfather, who she didn't speak until she was age 7, and then by age 8 she's sort of communicating like I'm communicating to you now, and starts disclosing what happened, and the stepfather said, I never thought she'd be able to speak. So we see that again and again and again. And the nature of the disability not only may make it more likely that they'll be victimized, but it might make it more difficult for them to defend themselves, or escape an abusive situation. We have evidence that says women with disabilities stay in abusive relationships longer. And it's hard enough to get out of a domestic violence situation if you don't have a disability. But if you're also relying on the person to care for you or get you out of bed in the morning, is the same person who's victimizing you, that complexity is increased significantly. And then another layer of complexity on that and it would go for men too, but the highest percentage is women. A woman with a disability who's being has intimate partner violence or is being victimized by her partner, maybe we don't have very good historically and currently across the country, and y'all might in your area. I guess I've been in Tennessee too long. I said y'all. Accessible shelters, accessible for folks with who are deaf or hard of hearing, who are blind or have low vision, or folks with physical disabilities or have service animals. Our shelters, our places of refuge aren't typically as accessible as they should be. Some are, and as I said, in your area you might have that. But again, if we look at the data, sexual assault's high, robbery's high, repeated abuses are common. Most folks know who's abusing them. And then we have some folks that are injured as a result and acquire their disability as a result of the violence or acquire a secondary disabling condition. I was sharing you this data before, and again, you'll have these slides. So I'll go, if I'm going rather quickly, don't worry, you'll have this information. But again, I shared some of this information already, that women with disabilities may be more likely to stay in abusive situations longer, and we sort of shared that. Sorry, as for those of you who joined, I said I'm presenting to you from my office, and life is happening around me all the time, and I'm triaging a number of things this morning, and as emails and voicemails and texts come in, you'll be hearing lots of sounds, and I may get distracted here and there, but I'm fully focused on everybody here. Reporting, we do see underreporting and folks out there who have been involved, who've worked in the domestic violence world or the older adult world or the child world. We know that abuse is typically underreported, and certainly in the disability abuse world, it's underreported. Now, not many crimes against individuals with disabilities are prosecuted. Very few. There's a number of reasons. There's a number of crimes committed against children that aren't prosecuted. There's a number of reasons that crimes aren't prosecuted. And I'm not going to suggest that district attorneys don't want to prosecute these crimes. They have a lot of factors that they have to consider. But the data is the data. Very few of these crimes are prosecuted. So we don't have 100% conviction rate. So what we're really left with is higher rates of victimization for our folks with disabilities than the general population. Underreporting is a problem, so the rate of victimization is probably higher. We don't prosecute many of these cases, and we don't have a 100% conviction rate. So what's the consequence of that? Well, the consequence of that is these people who are committing crimes against individuals with disabilities, their only consequence is they get to do it again. So one of the reasons I do take time to do things like this and speak with police officers and speak with district attorneys and judges when possible and frontline staff is to make this better, make this prosecution, this accountability in terms of prosecution and truly having the actionable criminalization of abuse against people with disabilities. Yes, it's a crime, but it's not actualized as a crime if very few people are being charged with it and we know it's occurring. So the next real question, and I'm going to pause in a second to see if folks have any questions on that. If these rates are so much higher, the next really does beg the question, why are people with disabilities victimized more? I've alluded to some of it before, but I'm going to get into susceptibility to victimizations, and I'll do it across certain disability groups, like folks with intellectual disabilities, then I'll talk about folks with autism, then folks with speech language, because they have some unique susceptibilities beyond what we would ordinarily consider. So I'm going to pause just for a minute. Eric, if anybody wants to type something in the chat or has a question, I'll pause and do that, and I'll take a drink of my morning coffee, which I'll be doing throughout the presentation as well.
We don't have any raised hands at this point. If you do have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and I'll open up your line. I'll give you a moment or two. No, it looks good, Scott.
Okay. Well, if somebody does have a question, feel free to ask it. I assume I just presented the information in such an unbelievable fashion that there went on. Totally kidding. Totally kidding. It's kind of like the data point. Okay. Well, that's kind of depressing. So let's talk a little bit about susceptibility to victimization. So here's a picture of me on the, I don't know how you're looking at your screen, but on my screen it's far right. My brother Lou on the far left, and our oldest brother Chris, who has an intellectual disability. Chris was born in New York, in Queens, New York, in 1965, back when it wasn't universally known that ultraviolet light lowers bilirubin and reduces jaundice. So serendipitously, had he been by the window in the nursery, his jaundice would have decreased and he wouldn't have had an intellectual disability. And most assuredly, I most likely wouldn't be presenting in front of you today. So Chris is wonderful. He lives in a community home. He served in the now in the Connecticut system, and he lives with 4 other gentlemen, so he's in a house of 5, and he's been living there for the last 20 so years. And when I lived back in Connecticut, I got to see him often, but he's just an amazing guy. He works. I could go on and on about him, but I'll move on. So why are people like Chris and others with intellectual disabilities susceptible to victimization? Well, one of the things is we tend to infantilize well, all individuals with disabilities, but it gets worse when there's a discrepancy between perceived chronological age and, perceived intellectual age and chronological age. So let me give you an example. Let's say you have an individual who, like my brother, like he's 48, but let's say, yeah, he's 48, but somebody would say he has the intellectual age of a 10-year-old. So do you treat Chris like he's 48, like he's 10? Do you add the 2 and split the difference, 58, treat him like he's, God, I didn't think there was going to be math, 58, what would be 29? So you don't treat him like he's 29, or you don't treat him like he's 48 or 10. How do you do it? Well, the answer is you treat him like he's 48, and how do you do that? Well, part of how you do it is in the tone that you use. We tend to use these very sort of childlike and whimsical tones with folks with disabilities, like, you are, hey, how you doing? I mean, think about your life. If somebody came up to you and said that, like who you met for the first time, you're like, hey, Eric, how are you? You'd kind of be like, what? Dude, come on. It's so awkward. So one of the reasons why we want to sort of move away from that, well, there's 2 reasons. One is when we treat somebody like an infant, they tend to act like an infant. But more insidious than that is if we constantly think of older children, adolescents, and adults as infants, we typically neglect to talk about sexuality, healthy relationships, and that, both from a research base and I can tell you from a practice base, increases a person's risk for being a victim or offender. I've worked in a number of cases, criminal cases, where I've had individuals sitting across from me wearing ankle bracelets that have intellectual disabilities that would not have ever been sitting across from me, in my opinion, had they had a healthy relationships course or a sexuality course. There is no doubt that there are individuals with disabilities that are sexual predators. There's also no doubt there are individuals with disabilities that are labeled as predators that are absolutely not predators. It is dangerous on both sides for the individual and for society when we get that wrong. We will decrease the risk of being an offender or a victim, and more likely decrease the risk of being a victim because that's the higher likelihood, by presenting information about healthy relationships, healthy sexuality, and we typically don't do that to infants. And it's necessarily not appropriate to talk to infants about healthy relationships and sexuality beyond maybe some general protection stuff. So if we think of adults as infants, we're never really going to talk about those issues, and that has to happen. Some individuals with intellectual disabilities may not know what constitutes abuse. They might know if something doesn't feel good, might be able to describe that it doesn't feel good, but they might not know it's abusive. And it makes me think of this case of a small town in Missouri where there was a pediatrician, and he was well liked in his community, and everyone respected him. Parents would drop their kids off for physicals if they needed a last-minute one for sports. And this pediatrician was part of everybody's sort of family in the community. And then one of the kids one day was getting really sick, and he had to go to the big hospital in St. Louis. So they brought him to St. Louis, and he was having a lot of gastrointestinal issues. And the physician, the GI specialist there, was describing he was going to do a rectal exam, and as he's describing what he's about to do, not to frighten this 5 or 6 year old boy, the 5 or 6 year old says, "Oh yeah, that's like what Dr. Smith does," and everybody in the room sort of paused and said, "Wait, what?" Well, it turned out that this pediatrician was molesting these boys. He was digitally penetrating these boys when their parents weren't there. They didn't like it, but they just assumed it was part of the exam. And I always give the example, when you go to the eye doctor and they do that in your eye, I mean, it's so uncomfortable. We just assume that they have to do that. I was told they have another procedure where they don't have to do that. But anyways, so we sort of sometimes it can take advantage of an individual not knowing what is a procedure or not. And certainly individuals with intellectual disabilities can be susceptible to that. People like my brother Chris, again, when I say people, I don't mean all individuals with intellectual disabilities. I mean individuals with intellectual disabilities like my brother Chris can be perceived as not being assertive, because he's not, having memory difficulties. Actually, he has a great memory. Or having a restricted vocabulary. Put those things together means you're not a good reporter of information. Not a good reporter of information. Well, I shared with you research earlier that shows that those people are selected as victims. They make good victims. And then, of course, there's fear of retribution and what I label fear of vacancy, of getting kicked out of your place, getting abused harder, or getting kicked out of where you live because you reported it and nothing happened, and the person who's victimizing you is still there. This happened in a case I had in San Fernando, California, just north of Los Angeles, where this 19-year-old girl with an intellectual disability and autism she would lift up her shirt and tell people she loved them and wanted to have their babies, and she clearly had no capacity to consent to sexual behavior. Well, the 44-year-old group home manager decided to have sex with her. She met him at some convenience store that she had access to, and he made her walk home, and she got upset. And so she said what happened. They called her a liar, and they kicked her out of the group home that she was in. So this fear of retribution, fear of vacancy, we see happen. I had a woman in New Mexico tell me who has an intellectual disability, a mild intellectual disability, and mental illness. And she was kicked out of her home because she was sort of verbally abusive to the staff. And she was homeless for about 2 weeks. And she said, had I known what it was like to be homeless, I would have let them beat me every day in that home, because there was nothing like it being on the streets. And I was just really sad when I heard that. But it gives you context for fear of retribution, fear of vacancy. She absolutely is at greater risk for being a victim now, because she's going to be less likely to report based on what happened to her. What about individuals with autism? This young man was again very similar to the guy I showed you before. His level of severity of autism was such that his needs were beyond what we could care for in our center, so he participated in our weekly clinic. Kids with autism are perceived vulnerable, and adults with autism, because by virtue of the disability, it's deficits in receptive expressive communication, so reporting information. But even those individuals with autism who do speak, they may have deficits in what's labeled referential communication. Referential communication is really important in disclosing abuse because you have to disclose it in your own words. So when you referentially communicate, you're communicating something to somebody that they otherwise wouldn't know. Very, very critical. Individuals with autism have difficulty detecting deception, so we know that sometimes predators use deceit to victimize, to lure folks into victimization. Individuals with autism are less adept at detecting deception. But something else about autism that I want to share, and I just started sharing recently over the last year or so, is this attribution issue. So a lot of times I see kids, adolescents, adults have sensory issues. And sensory issues, sensory integration disorder is part of the disability, should get better or at least not worse as the individual gets older. There's a number of reasons for that. Sensory systems change, and we sort of learn to adapt to what we like and don't like and what's aversive to us or not. Whether you have autism or not, you sort of do that as you get older. Therefore, you have less sensory issues in general. Well, so if the sensory issues are getting worse or sensory problems are getting worse, it's probably not a good idea to attribute those issues to the autism. And the classic example is fundamental attribution error. So the classic example of somebody walking down the street, you see them trip, most people think, oh, that person's clumsy. But if you're walking down the street and you trip and you look and you see that the sidewalk's bent up, you don't attribute your tripping behavior to being clumsy. You attribute it to this problem with the sidewalk. So then if we extend that out, then our treatment approach is vastly different if we attribute the tripping behavior to a busted up sidewalk, or we attribute the tripping behavior to somebody who's clumsy or somebody who maybe has balance deficiencies. We might send them to a balance class versus fixing the sidewalk. Treatment approach is vastly different. Individual with autism, if we attribute these sensory issues to sort of the autism getting worse versus maybe something else is going on. Maybe they have pain. Maybe they're being abused. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting if sensory issues get worse, somebody's being abused, but that could be one of the factors that's contributing to, or we would attribute to, these changes in sensory issues. And it's based on the classic study that was done with social workers, mental health workers. They took 4 of them, and they said, we're going to send you into a psychiatric institution. You're going to go see if you can get admitted. And say you have, you're hearing voices, hollow, sharp, thud, something like that. Give accurate histories, just hide the fact that you're a mental health employee conducting a study. So they all went and did that, and all 4 got admitted as having schizophrenia. So they were told, once you get admitted, stop complaining of hearing voices and act how you normally would act and just take notes. Guess what each and every one of the note-taking behaviors was attributed to? Paranoia associated with or attributed to the schizophrenia. All the physicians missed the fact that they're not hearing voices anymore, and why are they taking notes in a psychiatric facility? The other thing is, what was interesting is the other patients that had mental illness in these facilities would go up to the people who were in the study, and nobody knew who they were, but they'd go up and go, what are you doing here? You're not crazy. So the other folks knew, but the physicians missed it, because I think we sometimes take this attribution approach because we have a specific trajectory that we assume behaviors fall under. And for individuals with autism, we have to be careful that we don't just attribute changes in sensory behaviors or changes in overall behavior to the autism's getting worse, because that typically doesn't happen. It's not a guaranteed rule, but just in general. A couple distinguishing things about autism that I want to share. it's a deficit of expressive receptive communication. And one of the things that I share with law enforcement folks, because I think this is really, really critical, and I know most of you folks are direct support staff and administrators or supervisors, but I try to convey to law enforcement that you may have a disconnect between what somebody with autism is saying and how they're saying it. When we say something and it's not connected to what we're saying, we think automatically the person's lying. And that's especially true in the context of perceived criminal behavior or when somebody is reporting something. For example, if you said, if a question was to me, do I enjoy doing webinars? And I said, yeah, I really, really enjoy doing webinars a lot. It's great. You'd kind of like, wait a minute, that doesn't, there's a disconnect there. He's saying, I really, really enjoy it. I love doing them a lot, but yet my tone, my facial expression sort of convey a different meaning. Or if I was saying, yeah, I really, really love it, so I can convey yet a different emotion. When it's disconnected with what we're saying, it's really strange, and we automatically think, deceit, person's lying. So that can be problematic. We know that individuals with autism perceive faces differently. We actually have research, brain research, that shows in an area of the brain called the fusiform face area, or FFA, that it activates differently when perceiving faces of individuals. And that's our ability to sort of pick up on those non-vocal verbal cues of what a person's intentions are. It's not that individuals with autism can't see emotion, can't see expression. They have difficulty connecting, they have difficulty connecting the two. This is life. And for those of you joining and have no idea the context of me saying this is life, or for those of you who have been with me from the beginning and are getting annoyed at that, what can I say? This is life. Just kidding. A couple other autism distinguishing features. A lot of individuals with autism tend to be rule-governed. That means they like things that are predictable, that follow predictable patterns, but there's a big difference between being rule-governed and having obsessive-compulsive disorder. You can have both. You can have autism and OCD, but they always don't go together. And then again, consistent with autism is deficits in sensory integration or sensory integration disorder. And I don't need to spend a lot of time with that with this group, and I'm happy to answer questions if you have them either now or towards the end about sensory integration disorder. But I believe the group I'm speaking to has a pretty good experience among this population. A couple of things with speech-language disorder. We have a bias in this country. If somebody speaks well and vocal verbally, articulates themselves well, and use big words, we automatically assume that they're smart or perceive them to be smart. Versus if somebody is strained in what they're saying, we can't understand what they're saying, especially if maybe they're drooling. We don't think, oh, that person has a craniofacial anomaly that doesn't allow them to hold saliva in their mouth. We see drool or a kerchief. Somebody's talking like, hi, my name is, we automatically start to make assumptions that, oh, this person has an intellectual disability. And when we assume an intellectual deficit, somebody like Heather here now not only has the susceptibility to victimization of folks with communication disorders, she also now attributes all those characteristics of somebody like my brother who has an intellectual disability as well, because then we tend to infantilize, we perceive them as vulnerable, we perceive them, there might be fear of retribution, fear of getting kicked out, so all those factors play a role. Some individuals like Heather use alternative communication, but there's limitations on some types. Some systems are much more static and not dynamic and not good for reporting abuse. Some of these systems can be misused. In a case of like Heather, not Heather, but somebody like Heather, a caregiver stole their communication device when they left, and 2 months later when we got replaced the communication device, the first thing this young woman said was, my caregiver was beating me and starving me, and she had no way to communicate that for months, and her caregiver left the state, and there was no way they were going to go after her. So they might be susceptible to repeated victimizations.
Let's talk about how you like to spend your day. Like yesterday. What did you do yesterday?
Well, I wanted to go to church, but I woke up late.
Woke up late? What church did you go to?
I am currently a member of First Southern Baptist of Gardena.
First Southern Baptist.
Of Gardena.
Gardena, okay. Do you like going to church?
Yes, I know it.
You do? Why do you like going to church?
Because I sing in the choir.
You do? Okay. And you have a favorite song?
In the choir?
What's your favorite song?
With the wee boys and sing.
You know, I like that song too.
So how many of you watching, and maybe you can put in a question or chat, how many of you think Traza has an intellectual disability? I'm going to pause, see if anybody's brave enough to answer. Yes or no, does she have an intellectual disability? Well, let me help you out. First off, we shouldn't ever assume, and you should always assume an individual has a normal intelligence. And I know the word normal people take issue with, but we're just going to have to get over it. It's the shortest way to say neurotypical or typical or average intelligence. You know, individuals with normal intelligence, you should always assume that any individual that you interact with has average or typical normal intelligence. It will be better for them, it will be better for you. Some of the indicators, can anybody identify any of the indicators of why Traza does not have an intellectual disability, but she has cerebral palsy? But what are some things in this conversation that may clue you into that she doesn't have an intellectual deficit? Anybody?
To be fair, we did have one individual, Wendy Eden, who indicated that she had cerebral palsy.
Good job, Wendy. But do we think she has an intellectual disability? Well, the answer is no. But what indicators do you have that she does not have an intellectual disability in that exchange?
Well, from my perspective, she was able to respond appropriately to the questions, and the content of her responses was detailed.
Yes, it was detailed. She was tracking the conversation. Where's she go to church, Eric?
Well, I actually don't, Scott, but that's a discussion for another webinar.
No, where does she go to church? I wasn't asking where you go. I'm sorry. Do you remember where she said she went to church?
I didn't quite catch the name of the church.
Well, she said First Southern Baptist of Gardena, and he said First Southern Baptist, and she corrected him and said of Gardena. So she corrected mistakes. He asked her what her favorite song was, and she said in the choir. She asked for clarification. Correcting mistakes, asking for clarification, tracking the conversation are all higher order cognitive processes that indicate that she does not have an intellectual disability. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to come across as I was asking you if you went to church. But but most people would walk by Traza and hear her and assume automatically she has an intellectual disability because of her speech patterns. So I tell all the groups I speak to, don't do that. Don't assume intellectual disability based on the way somebody speaks or based on the way they look. Now, why would somebody with cerebral palsy be at greater susceptibility for victimization? Well, again, like individuals with intellectual disabilities, like individuals with autism, Individuals with cerebral palsy fall on a spectrum, so this doesn't hold true for all individuals with cerebral palsy. But those who do rely on others for bathing or bathrooming, it makes sense that you'd be more vulnerable, because if somebody asks to touch your penis, vagina, or anus on a daily basis, that opens it up for perhaps some risk of victimization. And again, most caregivers do a wonderful job. So I'm not suggesting folks caring for people who need assistance with activities of daily living are constantly abusing people. It's certainly a group of people that have access to individuals with disabilities, but most do a wonderful, wonderful job. But if you need assistance with eating and somebody has to help you eat, and notice I didn't say feed, somebody has to feed you or assist you. I said assist to eat or help you eat. I think there's a major distinction between the two. Assisting somebody eat means they're in control. Feeding somebody means you're in control. And I used to use that term all the time at our programs. You say, oh, can you help feed so-and-so or feed so-and-so? And we finally moved away from that, recognizing that the power should be for the person. Because if I'm helping somebody eat, I don't dictate what's eaten, how much is eaten, in the order in which the food is eaten. That should come from the individual. But if I have that power, that opens up for a risk of abuse. Mobility. If I control your mobility, or you need my assistance with mobility, I control where you go, when you go, who you go with. And if you need assistance with mobility, eating, and activities of daily living such as bathroom and bathing, then I have a lot of power over you. Again, most caregivers are not abusing that power, but that risk of victimization is there. And then if individuals with cerebral palsy, like Traza, have difficulty communicating, although she communicates quite well, they may be perceived as not having a good vocabulary, not being a good reporter of information, assuming they have an intellectual disability, and now assuming all of the risks of victimization, as I showed you in that slide before, like my brother Chris. A couple case studies of people who are good victims. I'll go through this rather quickly. I want to make sure to get to some of the other parts. A 22-year-old with fetal alcohol syndrome, Christina. What was horrific about Christina was her caregivers would lock her in a closet and stick pepper seeds under her eyes, and unfortunately would leave her in there, tie her up and leave her in there for hours on end. She would sit in there in her own feces and urine, and of course they threw pine cones in there to mask the smell, and they would keep her chemically restrained by giving her lots of Benadryl. Young girl with cerebral palsy was being sexually abused. It was noticed on an annual exam. The doctor noticed some trauma to her vaginal region. Her parents said that she was masturbating when we walked in and she pulled her hands out. Well, that clearly couldn't, she didn't have the motor control or intellectual ability to do that. They investigated further. They found finger and point bruises on her knees, and later her biological father confessed to raping her. Think of a young girl with the most severe disability that you've probably interacted with, somebody who needs assistance with everything, fed through a gastrointestinal tube, all of it. When she was discovered to be 8 months pregnant, there was a report for suspected child abuse. This girl's 14. Perp was never identified. Think about that for a second. Never identified. So it was a male, and a male who had access to the facility. I don't know how many males had access to the facility, but it had to be a finite number. And then what's really disturbing is the rest of the residents were tested, and over 80% of them had a variety of sexually transmitted diseases. This was a case that I was involved in California. Basically, these two caregivers were beating the crap out of this young man with autism, and he had self-injurious behavior. He'd hit his head and hit himself, and their defense was that that's how you treat somebody. Your treatment approach with somebody with self-injurious behavior is to, eye gouge them, punch them in the face, use their hair, quote, as a handle to bring them to the ground. Yeah. So we got guilty counts on both individuals. Pausing now for any questions that folks have before I go to sort of interview techniques, communication techniques, and so forth. I'll bring that sign back up in a minute.
We have kind of an interesting thing going on here in New York, Scott, in that while the data you're presenting are certainly troubling, we have a new state agency, and some of the investigators they're sending out into the field may not be as knowledgeable in terms of interviewing individuals with disabilities. And in some cases, not all, but in some cases, we even believe that their interviewing techniques have resulted in some additional traumatization.
Yeah, I mean, we worry about that in false confessions. Interrogation techniques aren't really appropriate for adults with intellectual disabilities. There's some new evidence about cognitive load and other things that are coming out that I'm actually just getting into because we train our CBS investigators using the READ method that our local police folks have, and I think that there's certainly considerations for individuals and adults with intellectual disabilities as alleged offenders about how they are interviewed. But the interview techniques that I share, and I do need to eventually add something about interviewing alleged offenders, but the interview techniques that I share deal with victims. And I assume that's what you were referring to, Eric?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that we find more often the case those folks are victims. And one of the things I like to do is I like to show this sign because it's funny because the most salient parts of the sign visually are that the sign has sharp edges. But if you're driving, the most salient part of the sign is the least visually attractive. It says also the bridge is out ahead. And I show this not just to show that this would be a poor communication technique, but that some individuals with autism and other disabilities might see this sign, if it said, the bridge is out, they actually might see the most salient aspect of that sign to them might be the sharp edges or the color of it. And with that, I think it's important when communicating to folks that we understand that people communicate using a verbal repertoire. And there really is only 4 basic types of communication. I absolutely get when people refer to paralinguistic communication, and I don't cover that here because it's embedded in one of these 4 types. So there's expressive vocal verbal, and I use the word vocal in front of verbal to highlight the difference between non-verbal, or what is more appropriately labeled non-vocal verbal. So expressive vocal verbal is speaking. If you understand what I'm saying to you, if I say, can you tell me what 10 plus 10 is, and you say 20, putting aside the math problem for a second, it's clear that you understood my expressive vocal verbal instructions because you answered correctly, so we would say you have receptive vocal verbal behavior. But we also have expressive non-vocal verbal behavior where we gesture, we use facial expressions and body postures. And then, of course, if you respond to my gesture, facial expression, or body posture, then you're said to have receptive non-vocal verbal. When we use the term nonverbal, we typically use it in terms of, oh, somebody doesn't speak. But the true essence of the word nonverbal means you don't have any of this verbal behavior at all. And that's pretty rare that somebody has no verbal behavior, that when you try to communicate with them, there is no contingent responding, either vocal verbally or non-vocal verbally. And we typically assume function, one's level of functioning, based on their level of vocal verbal behavior. So if somebody doesn't speak well, we typically label them lower functioning. And I want to talk about functioning for a second. Labeling somebody as high or low functioning, we have to move away from it. We actually have to move away from saying, oh, he functions like a 5-year-old, because it's crap. I used to say it, and professionals like me would get away with it all the time. And the analog I give is, today, if one of my investigators wrote a report and said, oh, I went into the house and the house was filthy, I would never let them get away with that because you can't observe filth. We would want them to write what? We'd want them to write, oh, there was garbage on the floor, there were dishes in the sink, there was mold in the refrigerator. Those are observable things. We can't observe low functioning. It's left to, or function like a 5-year-old. Well, first off, many 5-year-olds function quite differently. So we really, really have to move away from that. So when somebody says, oh, he functions or she functions at a 5-year-old level, or if you say that when you're explaining, you know, somebody, trying to describe somebody to, hopefully not law enforcement, but if it is law enforcement, don't do that. Talk about how they communicate, their level of independence, what are their support needs, what are their skill sets. Be very descriptive. Avoid saying functions like a 5-year-old because it doesn't mean anything, and people are left to interpret, what does that mean, functioning like a 5-year-old? As I said before, we have bias about how well people speak. I'm going to skip the story of Bert for now in the essence of time, but I do want you to pledge to me that you will, and help other people, not just you. You may already do this and probably do, but help other people not automatically assume intelligence. And people should assume normal intelligence until they have multiple data points to tell them something differently. And then, of course, treat people like people. And I have a little video clip from some kids I worked with. They're adults. They're not kids. See, I'm infantilizing. Adults that I've worked with in New Mexico.
People that really mean, I tell them, don't treat me like I'm broken. Just don't, because I'm not. At all. I mean, just trying to fit in. Just like other people. Exactly. Call us. Treat us like we're if we were like you. Yeah, we're the same people as you. Treat us with respect. Not just with respect. No, we're not toys. We're humans. Yeah, we're humans.
Well said. I don't need to do much beyond that. A couple things. When interviewing individuals with disabilities, the interviewer should have knowledge of, and again, this is information you can share with your new office, and I've been to that office recently, the one up in Albany. Interviewers should have knowledge of the office is near Albany. Eric, I can't remember where the office is. I've been there. It was when I was up in
Delmar, New York.
What's that?
Delmar.
Yeah, that's right, near Saratoga.
Oh, Saratoga Center for the Family. That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So the interviewer should have knowledge of their language, their memory abilities, recognize that intellectual disability is a spectrum, just like autism is a spectrum, cerebral palsy is a spectrum, but that individuals with intellectual disabilities are uniquely susceptible to leading. And interviews should match the developmental level, not perceived intellectual age, but the developmental level, just like any good interview, to the individual. Pace should be set by the victim or victim witness. They should be able to describe events in their own words or respond in using gestures. Rapport building's absolutely important, not just for gaining trust, reducing anxiety, but also you get baseline information about the individual's developmental level in terms of their ability to communicate. I'm going to skip through this slide, or I'm going to go through it relatively quickly. These are just some basic guidelines if the allegation of abuse or neglect is in a facility. Some things that folks should need, like listing employees, staffing schedules, floor plans, policies. But one really important thing is what I label as the continuity of policy versus practice. As many of you know, if you're direct support staff, that there are policy practice gaps. Things in policy either can't account for everything we do in practice, or there's a disconnect between policy and practice. And then we want to make sure that we minimize contaminating an individual's memory because of that susceptibility. And just quickly on memory, most folks think that memory is a reproduction of an event, and it's not for anybody. It's really a reconstruction of events that were salient to you, meaningful to you at the time through your lens and perspective, not just your historical lens and perspective, your actual physical perspective and lens combined, and what you found meaningful. So it's a reconstruction of what happened. That's why two people can see the same thing and report it very differently. You could have it on video, and we would report it differently. I used this example with one of my staff here when I was highlighting this point. Was we watched a clip of a football game and a catch. I asked the staff, was it incomplete or was it complete? And some of the staff said it was complete, some said it was incomplete. And we watched it, and we kept watching it over and over again, and we still couldn't come to agreement. So when somebody's recalling something and reconstructing what happened, it's hard to say, you can't ever say, oh, that's what really happened, because we have people watching videos of a catch, and some will tell you it was a catch, and some will tell you it was not. So what really happened? Was it really a catch or not? Well, we certainly can say, well, what did the referees say? But the greater point is we'll never really understand what really happened, because what really happened only exists in the reconstruction of the event from the individual. And that can be more difficult for individuals with intellectual disabilities, but the research tells us that they can recall information accurately. You just have to have certain techniques to be able to do it better. 3 Ps I teach folks about when interviewing an individual with an intellectual disability. Pause. After asking a question, there should be an 8 to 10 seconds, and that's very long for most people, before you ask another question or repeat or rephrase or repeat. Second P is prompting cues. These are in the literature called facilitative cues. So somebody talks about, oh, I just finished up for dinner. Your next question would be, so they said the words, and we just finished cleaning up for dinner. You would say, great, so you just finished cleaning up for dinner, and then what happens? So you sort of build on what they told you. And the last P is pain, and this is an interesting one. There are some people that believe some individuals don't feel pain, and that doesn't mean that people with disabilities don't feel pain. In fact, it's extremely rare for someone not to feel any pain. But they may respond, some individuals may respond differently to pain. They may respond differently in terms of describing pain. But I want all folks to understand that it is an extremely rare condition for somebody not to feel pain. We have a few more minutes to go. I'm going to say a couple things, and then I'm going to pause to see if folks have any questions. So when asking questions, ideally be able to ask open-ended questions, like tell me what happened on Thursday, or what happened in the bedroom, tell me more about that. But some individuals, they may only be able to answer yes or no. And we're taught in interviewing that when you ask yes-no questions, they can be very leading. So like a leading yes-no question would be, did Mr. Steve touch your penis, when there was no prior identification of Mr. Steve at all? Did Brian hit you? No mention of Brian. So a better non-leading question, although you could still argue this is leading in some sense because you're introducing hitting, but it's acceptable to ask this. Did somebody hit you? Do you know who hit you? And even people who can only answer yes-no can answer yes-no to those questions. But sometimes initial questions can be too hard for an individual, and then I recommend using what's called reverse scaffolding. Here's an example.
So what do you think you were your name? How did you get here this morning? Right. How are you doing? Good. You doing okay? Okay. All right.
Sorry, I just had somebody come into my office. So what happened with Mary was she was asked, how did you get your name? And she said, you know, I was little. That's a very difficult question for somebody with an intellectual disability. How do you get your name? So she said, I was little. And she said, you were right. You were little, but who do you think gave you your name? I was little. I like it. So then Janet backs up and tries to ask her an easier question, says, how'd you get here today? And she says, I like it. She's sort of stuck. So then Janet backs up even further and says, okay, how you doing? And she says, oh, I'm doing fine. And now she's ready to move forward. And the example that I give is an example. I was working with a kid, and I asked him to, he got up and he went to throw out a piece of paper, and it went in the garbage. And I said, you know, pick up the paper, and he just sort of stared at me. So I walked him through sort of reverse scaffolding. Because this was a physical task, I said, okay, raise your hand, touch your nose, give me a high five, go pick up the paper. And he went and did that. What happened was I built momentum for him. I created this instructional sequence where I went from high probability, right, raise your hands much easier, touch your nose is a little harder, high five, extend out, go pick up the paper, was sort of build momentum for him. I'm going to pause for a second. I told you this is real life. I got to go deal with something. It'll take me about 1 minute, Eric. But let's use this time for folks to ask questions. Sound good?
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay, so while Scott is attending to his office duties, if you have a question, please feel free to enter it into the question box on your GoToWebinar display, or you can raise your hand, and I will open your audio line.
All right, I bet we had a bunch of questions, or no?
Well, we did get one.
Good.
Question related to the pausing 8 to 10 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
That is a long period of time. Is that designed to like increase the tension between the interviewer and the interviewee, so that the interviewee feels that he or she should respond?
No, it's certainly not designed to increase tension at all. Processing, so this is a technique that's used for young children as well. It takes folks with intellectual disabilities, again, not all, but some more time to process. So when you rapid fire questions, so if I ask you a question and I only wait a couple seconds and then I ask you again, oftentimes individuals need more time to process auditory information. Secondly, they may have a history of not being listened to, so they may not recognize that somebody's actually wanting to listen to them. So it is absolutely, it's an excellent question, absolutely not meant to increase tension. It's actually meant to give that person time to respond. Now, if you're interviewing somebody and you know this person and you know that they, process information very, very quickly, then no, you wouldn't want to wait for 8 to 10 seconds. But that's a general guideline for pausing. In fact, for audiences, the guideline, so folks like you, if I was in front of you and I could see you, which I can't, it would be they say you wait up to 20 seconds before, if you say, are there any questions, you would wait up to 20 seconds, and although it does get uncomfortable after about 9 or 10.
Thank you.
Okay, great question. So saliency is another big thing. So Eric, I'm going to ask you a question, okay?
Okay.
What did you have for lunch 2 Wednesdays ago?
Well, ironically, I can probably answer that because I have the same thing every day.
All right, how about how about dinner?
I have no idea.
Right, and why is that? Well, because it's not real salient to you. But if you had dinner with the President of the United States, and whether you are a fan or not a fan, doesn't matter, you would have remembered what you had, right?
Yes.
Right. It's because that's salient. I mean, it's not something you do all the time. Well, the saliency of common events might be greater for the folks, some of the folks that we serve, because either they don't get to do these things as often, or it just happens to be salient to them. landscape of saliency may be very different than what we would normally expect. What they perceive to be more emotionally significant may be different, and we see this especially true for individuals with autism. They may find things in the environment salient that we find very trivial. And you can use saliency in a very effective and powerful way. Here's an example.
And what'd you have?
So I don't know if you could hear that or see that, but he asked Keith, he said, well, what we had for dinner was tater tots, chicken nuggets, and these Chinese egg rolls. So I would use that sort of element later with him and mention the victimization, and he wasn't victimized in this situation. But if it occurred, if I knew it occurred approximately sometime in the evening after dinner, I might say, okay, Keith, remember you were eating those delicious Chinese egg rolls. And what that does, salient events, salient items, tell our brain, pay attention. So when I was a professor, I had a dirty, nasty four-letter word I would use if I saw the students were starting to sort of drift off or looking down. I would say, okay, well, this information will be on the quiz, and all of a sudden you'd see heads pop up. You know, the word quiz or the word exam in the context of a college classroom is salient to college students. For whatever reason, those Chinese egg rolls were salient to Keith. So you can use salient events not just to build rapport, but to tell the brain, pay attention, and you can use it to connect events. Last things on communication disorders, then I really will pause for questions and answers. When communicating with folks with communication disorders, it takes more time. You have to be a little bit more patient and avoid saying he or she doesn't communicate. That's inaccurate. You should say, I'm not able to communicate with them. If the speech is hard to understand, use yes-no format. Don't be afraid to say, I'm sorry I didn't understand you. Here's an example.
Do you find that people are afraid of you? Yeah, kind of. Kind of. Can you tell me some of the things that people do? Look kind of funny like while you're walking down the street? On the beach, yeah. To the mall. As you're walking to the mall, what happens? Look at you, funny. They look at you funny? I didn't catch that last part. Teenagers. Oh, so teenagers look at you funny. And how does that make you feel? And that hurt. Oh my God.
So most people can get at the end, what did she say? All my life they do it. And sometimes I'll play that clip in the beginning for folks, and about half or more can't understand what she's saying, but then when I play the clip all the way through, they get it. And that's because your brain starts to sort of tune in a little bit. And it makes it easier the more you listen to somebody. But it does take a lot of energy and effort, and it takes a little bit more time. But sometimes you really just can't understand what somebody's saying verbally or vocal verbally at all.
And do you have your ID with you right now? Can I see it? You don't have it with you? You do? Okay, all right.
I can give you better volume on that. You still won't understand what he's saying. So do you think he understood what was being asked of him? Well, if you play it back in your brain, when he asked does he have his ID, he starts to nod his head and kind of reaches for what looks like he's reaching for a wallet. So at least we know he understood. He had receptive vocal verbal behavior. But what do you do when you can't understand what somebody's saying? I recommend creating yes-no. communication. I would have said to that young man right there, okay, I see that you're nodding your head when I asked if you had your wallet. So I think, when you say, is that how you say yes? And then, you know, if he nodded his head, I said, well, how would you say no? And then you would hope he would shake his head, and then we're in good shape. I also bring with me things like this tree, these cards. I mean, I don't carry them all the time, but if I'm interviewing somebody, and I might say, okay, the young man, Christian, I just want to be sure that I'm getting this right, Christian. I want to be sure that I fully understand how you say yes and how you say no. Yes or no, is this a picture of a house? And of course, we would expect a no example. And then I would say, is this a picture of an ice cream cone? We would expect a yes. Is this a picture of a dog? And we would expect a yes. Or you could do this in any order. Or other pictures, really simple things that most people would answer yes to and most people would answer no to. In research, this is called lie scale validity. But it really gives you a powerful sense of, okay, this person is contingently answering yes, no, and not just randomly. If you can't understand what they're saying, you can ask the person to write or draw the response. Show you is a good one. And I give the example, my brother Chris one year asked what he wanted for Christmas, and he said Asapa. And I had no idea what he was saying. He doesn't write, he doesn't draw, he doesn't spell. I never said show me. That probably would have helped. So I did the next best thing. I said, hey, Ma, what's Chris want? And my mother, who could understand him better than I could, she couldn't understand it either. And it wasn't until a few months later where we were walking by a record store and he pointed and he said, Asapa. And I looked at it, I was like, oh, okay. He wanted the record by Air Supply, which was really funny at the time. But not as funny now because I kind of like Air Supply still, I think. Some folks use pictures or other communicative devices, and we call some of these AACs, augmentative or alternative communication devices. There's iPads, there's Dynavox, or an iPad really is the sort of the Dynavox of today. There's picture boards. People with autism use things called PACs. There's a whole bunch of them. But don't assume that if somebody uses one that they have an intellectual disability. Don't assume that that's the only way that they communicate. You don't need special training to communicate with somebody who uses AAC. You should speak directly to them. Try not to interrupt. And any good interviewer is comfortable with silence. So I'm going to leave you with one final voice, and then we'll pause for station identification and question and hopefully reasonable answers.
Do you find that people treat you like you don't understand anything? You find that people assume that you're not aware of what's going on? Well, is there anything you want to say when people think that, you know, you don't understand what's going on, or you are not aware of anything?
Yes.
What would you like to say?
Like I love you. I hate people around me that I can trust. Loyalty means I can share things with you and I can trust you with my secrets. I have told staff members personal information before and they told others. I felt betrayed. Please do not betray my trust. Once you lose my trust, it will take a long time to win it back. Let me speak for myself. Some people with disabilities need more time to respond. I have my own voice. Do not speak for me. Do not speak about me in front of me like I am invisible. I want to make my own decisions when possible. Please give me the opportunity to be my own advocate.
Pretty awesome. I really like that she takes a lot of time to type that in. Most people would see her, they'd see the wheelchair, they'd see her kerchief, they'd see some drooling, and they would automatically think intellectual disability. I tell folks, again, law enforcement, CPS, APS, DAs, get more experience interacting with people with disabilities. It'll be better for you. And for everybody, let's avoid assuming intelligence based on language, appearance, or just a label. Let's avoid assuming intelligence or communication ability based on language, appearance, or a label. Happy to answer any questions anybody has.
We have no hands up. I'm going to wait the requisite 8 to 10 seconds, though.
I'll take questions or comments. Was this helpful, or Anything missing? I'll take positive and or constructive feedback if you don't have any questions. Happy to answer any questions, though, as well.
Okay, we do have Virginia from our Chautauqua County. Virginia, are you there? Let's see. Okay, Virginia, you are off mute. Can you hear us? Okay. We're having trouble getting her. We have one comment that this was extremely helpful.
Great. Thank you.
And we have a question. Jean Patella indicates that it was also extremely helpful. So feedback seems to be very positive.
Good. Sorry I had to leave for a second.
Are there any other questions or comments before we allow Scott to leave and resume his day? Okay, a couple other comments. Kim Andrews indicates this was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
You are an awesome presenter. That's very good.
Thank you. It's tough to do it in front of staring at a computer.
Virginia did type in her comment. She said she just wanted to let you know how informative this was, especially the cards in terms of, I guess, baselining yes and no responses.
Good.
And Kelly from our Niagara chapter also said that she found the presentation to be very helpful for incident investigators.
Well, I'll present to this group anytime if all I'm going to get is positive feedback. Y'all make me feel good.
I'm only reading the positive one, Scott.
Ah, get out of here.
No.
I'll take constructive too.
Let me just see if there's anything else. A couple people want more information like this, which is great. And actually, just as a reminder, this is being recorded. I will put this up on the NYSARC YouTube page and send out some materials. I should also mention that Scott has a variety of webinars that are already posted online, and with that information, I will send that link out. There's a number of different trainings that are available that can be listened to at your convenience.
Yeah, I'm actually doing another one for the Midwest Regional Children's Hospital this afternoon on safety systems in child welfare. May not be of interest to your folks, but I have one of my colleagues and I are going to kind of sit right here and do the presentation. So that one will be up on that site as well.
Well, I just want to take the time to thank you, Scott, for taking time out of your day. I think this was very helpful, and I feel that both the state office and also the chapters will be able to use you as a resource either through me or directly through your email that you have on the screen. And again, we are very thankful that you chose to spend some time with us today.
You got it. Thank you, and thanks for the feedback, everybody. Have a great day, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Okay.